You're listening to the Cycling Podcast in association with Rafa, celebrating the sport and producing the finest cycling clothing since 2004.
Hello, my name's Richard Moore. I'm with Lionel Birnie.
Hello again, Richard.
In the company of Lionel Birnie.
I'm back.
And Daniel Friebe.
Hello, how's it going?
All right, Daniel, how are you over there in Berlin?
Fine, weather's terrible. Shocking.
Oh dear.
Shocking.
It's dry here, at least in central London.
Watford. Oh, you know in Watford today, Lionel?
No.
It's a nice autumnal day, isn't it, Lionel?
It is. This is the podcast of the falling leaves, I think. We should officially name it that.
We're actually standing under a tree. It's also I guess this is the final podcast of the year when we'll talk about bike racing.
Oh no, there's still the International Presidency Tour of Turkey.
And
we're
actually
going to talk about
the 6-day racing as well.
Does that mean for the next 4 months we get to talk about football?
No.
We talked about
not.
napalm. We've had some complaints. Predictably, we've had some complaints about my persistent, continual use of football references. And we decided we were going to have to introduce some kind of fine or buzzer system, or the soccer Stasi. We're going to have to step in.
Well, let's hope that next week I have reason to talk about football, because it's the podcast El Clasico, isn't it? Watford against Arsenal.
That's
derby,
enough
isn't
of that. Who would have believed that we're in the same place as we were a few weeks ago, Lionel? And just as we started recording the podcast a few weeks ago, a couple of Muppets began playing table tennis, and lo and behold, exactly the same things happened again.
Surely you're recording in our £1,000 an hour studio, high-tech studio, chaps.
No, we're standing under a tree, as mentioned already.
Fools.
We don't want to go soft over the winter. We have to record in all sorts of outdoor locations at the Grand Tours, don't we? So
keep it real. Keep it real. Lionel, for this podcast of the Falling Leaves, do give us a weekly news roundup, please.
Well, it's just a recap of the race results, really, this week, Rich, because the European season really has... Turkey. I mean, I'm going to get into all sorts of trouble here. Turkey's in Europe, isn't it?
Not part of the EU, Lionel.
Well, it's not part of the EU, no. But that's we're proving that you can be in Europe and not be part of the EU, eh? Britain's going to prove that in triumphant style in the next indefinite period. Anyway, a couple of big races in France, a couple of big races in Italy. Start with France. There was Paris-Bourges, a one-day race, which was won by Rudy Barbier, and poor old Rudy Barbier was then on the receiving end of Nasser Bouhanni's wrath afterwards. Bouhanni was complaining that Barbier had sprinted badly, irregularly, and that all flared up there. And then at the weekend there was Paris Tour, which is, I think, a cracking race. Now, the last sort of 8 or so years that they've sorted out the course with the 2 little climbs at the finish. Quick Step Floors won that for the 3rd year in a row. Matteo Trentin's 2nd win in 3 years. Of course, Fernando Gaviria won it last year. Gaviria was the pre-race favourite, but fell off on a right-hand corner with about 18 kilometres to go. Had a good stab at trying to get back on, but Quick Step didn't wait for him, basically. They pressed on. Matteo Trentin and his teammate
Nicky Terpstra,
of course. Thank you, Richard. They got away with Soren Kragh Andersen of Team Sunweb, and poor old Kragh Andersen, he was in the quick step sandwich, wasn't he? Terpstra led it out. Trentin got the victory. And that's his final race for Quickstep before he goes to Orica Scott next season. Meanwhile, over in Italy, there was Milano-Torino, which was won by Rigoberto Urán of Cannondale Drapac. An impressive win, that. But he paid for it on Saturday, because when everything all kicked off on the second last climb, Urán kind of went backwards. But really, nobody else could stick with Vincenzo Nibali, who won Il Lombardia for the 2nd time in his career. Really impressive victory that was. Thibaut Pinot did his best, but came unstuck on the descent, and Nibali soloed over the final climb. And it's been a really strong end of season for Nibali and Bahrain-Merida in those Italian races.
I think somebody, maybe you, Oh, sorry, your mouth was still open there, Lionel. Did you have something else?
Well, I was just going to say, next week, we come to the end of the European season, and by this time next week, well, not quite this time next week, but in next week's podcast, we'll be reviewing the Tour de France 2018 route. Lots of rumours coming out. I don't deal in speculation, as you know, but We suspect that Alpe d'Huez is on the menu if reports by local newspapers in the Alpine region are to be believed. So Alpe d'Huez is back.
But Lionel, likely to be a novel twist on Alpe d'Huez.
Yes, it's going to...
likely to be something like what we saw in the Dauphiné this year. I don't think it's going to be that exact iteration of Alpe d'Huez whereby they climbed up the Col de Sarenne and then sort of intersected with the normal Alpe d'Huez road about 2 kilometres from the finish. I think they are likely to climb up from a place called, I think it's called Villa Recula, which is on the west of the normal ascent to Alpe d'Huez, and again it sort of intersects with the normal road a bit below the resort. I think that's what's going to happen.
Somebody pointed out that Nibali now, if you look at his record, I mean, he's had a good year. That was the win that he needed, wasn't it, with the podium finishes. In fact, he had an almost identical year this year to Chavez last year, who finished on the podium at the Giro and the Vuelta and then won Lombardia. But Nibali has won either a Grand Tour or a Monument every year for about the last 6 years or something. Is that right, Daniel? You probably know the answer to that.
It's bound to be wrong. Any statistic that we give is bound to be right, but it's bound to be almost right, but not quite. But yeah, it does sound
right. I think
right.
I was vague enough to not get in too much trouble there.
Well, yeah, I mean, he is incredibly consistent. His record in Grand Tours is also unbelievably consistent. Since 2010... No, since 2009, and I've got the information is actually in front of me, so even I cannot go wrong here, surely.
As long as it's accurate information.
He has finished outside the top 10 in Grand Tours twice. On one of those occasions, he was disqualified in 2015. On the other occasion, he finished 30th in the 2016 Tour de France. And otherwise, it's pretty much, with a couple of exceptions, been podium finishes and wins.
And I think what has impressed me this year about Nibali, not only consistency, but the way that he's taken his wins. I'm thinking about the way he kind of mugged Mikel Landa at the Giro, the way that he won the Sagen to Andorra at the Vuelta, here at the at Tour Lombardia as well. Just very, very clinical and very shrewd, and showing real kind of tactical skill, tactical knowledge, tactical nous, if you like, that we don't always associate with sort of Grand Tour overall contenders, but he's become extremely good at winning races, and that win in Lombardy was, he knew what he was doing, didn't he, and it was absolutely clinical in finishing it off.
And he would have been very grateful that the rider that was with him in the crucial stage of the finale was Thibaut Pinot.
But what was interesting was just how desperate he was to get rid of him.
Yeah, well, he was, yeah. But he knew he could do. I mean, as soon as he started putting the pressure on round the corners, you could see Pinot, almost the second thought flashing across his mind, and the gap opened a little bit and then a little bit more, and then suddenly, 5 metres became 20 metres, 50 metres, and then he was away. And it wasn't just the descent, though, it was the way he then, because it was a good old distance from there to the finish. He had to then, get over that last climb. And so it wasn't just a win for a daredevil descent, he had the strength to finish it off as well.
And Pinot, for somebody who a few years ago was scared of descending, that was his real weak spot, still rode pretty well. I mean, Nibali, the margins are tiny, aren't they? And I think Nibali back in the Olympic road race in Rio, we could be talking about him as Olympic champion as well, had he not crashed on that descent. No doubt he took some risks on Saturday at Lombardy, but it paid off. It might not have done, and Pinot might have been the guy we were hailing as the guy who rode it a little bit more cautiously, but more sensibly.
Yeah, he was lucky rich as well, or always is in Lombardy, in the sense that he knows those roads very well, but he also lives, of course, in Switzerland, just over the border, and very familiar with climbs like the Civiglio. He attacked on the descent of the Civiglio. And, you talk about the tactical acumen that he's demonstrating. I think a lot of that is obviously coming from confidence, but on Saturday I thought that he looked so strong, particularly on that Civiglio climb. It was you were wondering, you were trying to think of ways in which he wasn't going to win, because he just did look a cut above everyone else.
My name's Lauren Delaney, and I'm a performance nutritionist at British Cycling, and I work specifically with the sprint and BMX athletes and the paracycling athletes as well. I've generally found that cyclists have been a little bit more on it in terms of their nutrition. I think because it's a linear energetic sport, most of the time you can see a big impact of nutrition, and in terms of the challenges from their training sessions in the different competition environments, where in the likes of team sports or sports where tactical and technical elements play a much bigger role. So for example in badminton, it's a lot more difficult to show that relationship between, okay, well I had a really good meal today, so that will have a direct impact. A lot of the times just the tactical elements in a game can have a bigger influence. And then I suppose with cycling as well, there's other factors. So for example on the endurance side, cycling for quite a long period of time, you have to be able to fuel that. And then in terms of the sprint side, their weight, for example, and their power to weight ratio getting off the line on the track is quite important. So their mass on a whole can be crucial.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport, fueled by science.
Thank you very much indeed to Science in Sport, who sponsor the Cycling Podcast. We heard a little bit there from Lauren Delaney, nutritionist at British Cycling. And we are very grateful to Science in Sport. And of course, our listeners, that's you, can all get 20% off your Science in Sport products at scienceinsport.com with the code CPAUG20. CPAUG20. If we sound a little bit different, that's because our circumstances have changed since we last spoke to you about 3 minutes ago. We've moved, haven't we, chaps?
We have. We had a catastrophic equipment failure yesterday in central London, so we've had to. Well, I'm at home, Richard. I'm assuming
we've scattered. Yeah. We're no longer under a tree.
No.
I miss our tree, Lionel.
Yeah. The podcast of the falling leaves continues though, because they're all falling off the big trees at the back of our garden. It's going to be it's very autumnal here today. Cold. Well, winter is coming.
Well, Lionel, you sound in your element there. The misanthropic Lionel. We'll soldier on regardless of scattering to the winds as we have done. Much like a falling leaf, in fact. And Tour of Lombardy. Well, I was paying fulsome tribute to Vincenzo Nibali. It was a cracking race with a great field, which helps a lot. It feels almost like the Tour of Lombardy is back, with GC riders and classics riders all competing. It did seem a period of time when the field wasn't always great, but it does feel like Tour of Lombardy really does matter again. But there was it wasn't all good news from Saturday, because there were a number of very nasty crashes, weren't there, Lionel? Yeah, there were. The one that everybody probably saw on television was the quick-step rider Laurens de Plus plummeted over the barrier and down quite a drop, and looked to be in a bad way initially, and everyone obviously, nobody likes seeing those kind of incidents, and as ever the cameras lingered perhaps a little bit too long. It was on the descent of the Sormano climb, just inside the last 50 kilometres, and De Plus is fortunately out of hospital. He's got some injuries, but he's going to be fine. Jan Bakelants of AG2R, Simone Petilli of UAE Team Emirates, and Daniel Martinez of Villa Tristina also crashed on the same corner. And Bakelants is quite seriously injured. Broken vertebrae. Hopefully it will be okay. But it just shows that while we laud Vincenzo Nibali's descending skills, it does mean that risks are taken, and particularly this time of year, the surface might not necessarily be bone dry or completely wet, sort of half and half, and the falling leaves, without making too much of a light of it, they make for a tricky surface as well in places. But it does seem that descent of the Sormano, I don't know it particularly well, Daniel, but it's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, it's one of the harder, faster descents you'll see in professional racing. There are things they could do to make it slightly safer. That bend in particular, there is a case for the organisers putting mattresses up, as they've done, I think, on the Poggio in Milan-San Remo, on the Cipressa. There are a couple of nasty bends there, and that's been quite a good solution. I can't remember who it was, but there was a rider who slammed into one of the mattresses at San Remo this year, I think, on the corner where I think Gerard Cielek went off a couple of years ago. But I don't think it's necessarily too dangerous. The riders obviously can decide what speed they go down it. That might sound slightly glib, but I think that's the reality. It's also quite a spectacular descent. Certainly, if you ride it with the views over Lake Como as you come down, it's very, very spectacular. And also, just strategically, it's an interesting point in the race because the sort of valley road that comes after that is in fact not really a valley. It's certainly very undulating, and a lot of interesting things can happen there tactically. So I think if they do finish in Como, it's a part of the course that the organisers will probably want to keep in future.
It was, I must say, I really didn't like the constant replays of De Plus's crash at a moment when we didn't know what happened to him. I don't know who makes these decisions, but I don't want to see the crash over and over again, even if I know he's okay, really. But it's I don't know who. I just don't like it. So didn't enjoy that aspect of watching the race on Saturday. Anything else catch your eye in Lombardy before we move on to talk about Paris Tour on Sunday?
Well, I thought Julian Alaphilippe's late bid to, it was never going to work. He was never going to catch Nibali, but it was a strong move, and he got second place in the race. And I was looking back at the 5 monuments this year. That's Milan-San Remo, the Tour of Flanders, Paris-Roubaix, and Liège-Bastogne-Liège in the spring, and Il Lombardia in the autumn. And excuse me, Alaphilippe is one of 5 riders who has finished in the top 5 of 2 of those races. Gianni Moscon is another one, because Moscon was also 5th in Paris-Roubaix and he was 3rd in Il Lombardia. Alaphilippe, of course, was 3rd in Milan-San Remo, so he's done very well in the 2 Italian races. And it was interesting sort of seeing the suggestion by Pier Bergonzi of La Gazzetta dello Sport, which of course is a sister to RCS. It's its own. It's not the same company, is it, Daniel? It's a sort of sister. Is it exactly the same company? Right. Oh, well, so Pier Bergonzi, a very respected Italian journalist, making the case that perhaps Il Lombardia could move to the spring and have all 5 of the monuments running in the springtime. Of course, then it wouldn't be the race of the falling leaves. We'd have to come up with another English nickname for the race. Mauro Venni, the race director, has flatly denied that there's been any suggestion that Il Lombardia could move to the spring. But I initially, my kind of conservative traditionalist persuasion led me to kind of dismiss this idea out of hand. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought perhaps this is a way to kind of tie the calendar together and have the 5 monuments on 5 consecutive weekends, running from sort of late March through to, I guess it would be late April. I don't know what you guys think, but we would then have a kind of, you'd have a Milan-San Remo kicking it off, and then the 2 cobbled classics, and then Liège and Lombardy perhaps back to back. I don't know. I can see some logic to that, particularly when we've said so many times that the one thing the UCI calendar is lacking is sort of a sense of cohesion, a sense of, stories that you can tie up and say, well, we'll move on from this part of the season, and then Grand Tour season starts after this.
I think it's a load of old hogwash, Lionel. Absolutely terrible suggestion. I think Pier Bergonzi is mainly advocating it because, as we know, as we discovered in the Giro, one of Pierre's big passions now is wine, and at this time of the year his thoughts turn to the harvest and the, what they call it, la vendemmia. No, I don't think it's a good idea. The season, some would suggest the season already peters out slightly after the Tour de France. And certainly after the Vuelta, and really I think if the UCI and race organisers have any, sometimes they don't seem to have much control over what they're doing, but what they really want to be doing is kind of starting to backload the calendar a little bit more, as has sort of started to happen by hook or crook with this block of Italian races that have really this year seemed to form, partly with the help of TV deals, I must say, because the awareness of these races has grown a lot this year, but they're really forming now quite a coherent block of racing at the end of the season. Giro dell'Emilia, Tre Valli Varesine, Milan-Turin, and then Lombardy. And I thought this year it was a really good sort of full stop exclamation mark at the end of the season. And Lombardy, I think, it's maybe to sort of lapse into romanticism slightly, but Lombardy is about the falling leaves. It is about the sort of mist collecting over the lakes in Lombardy, and it has a particular feel about it, which I think it would lose if the date moved.
I mean, it's an odd thing to suggest after a really good edition of the race. If Lombardy was struggling to attract the star names, and if the race was struggling to capture people's imagination, you could understand why you would be calling for change, but it seems like an odd time to call for change. Also, those other races that Daniel mentions, they would really lose their meaning, wouldn't they, without they form a sort of path to Lombardy. Interesting that Nibali missed Milan-Turin, which is on the Thursday, which is very close to Lombardy. That's got to take a bit out of you before the race on Saturday, but most riders did ride both. But yeah, those races would struggle, and it was a nice block of racing, and it is a lovely time of year in Italy. They look beautiful. The fields were good, the races were good winners, and great crowds. And I know we're going to talk about Paris Tour. I was struck. Paris Tour was also a great race, but I was struck by the contrast between Italy and France in terms of roadside spectators. All the races in Italy were, really well attended. Great crowds on the climbs in particular. Paris Tour, really, it wasn't great weather, admittedly, but pretty poor crowds, pretty thin by the side of the road.
Yeah, it's lost a lot of its luster, Paris Tour, as we've mentioned on numerous occasions over the past few years, and it's a shame because you guys said it was a great race this year. I think it's always a really good race. Particularly when there have been climbs in the finale, the what's the famous one they used to use, the Côte de l'Épin, I think.
The L'Épin's the last one, and it's the Beau Soleil before that.
Correct, yeah. And it's not dissimilar from Milan-San Remo in the sense that there is this always this question of whether a break can go or an attack can stick over the final climb, and it's often thought of as a sprinter's classic. But if you look back at the results of the last few years, actually there have been quite a number of occasions when it hasn't been a typical bunch sprint where someone has just launched it, with 200 meters to go, and it's certainly not the kind of race where you see big lead out trains at the end. It's such a long race and a hard race that you get a lot more interesting things happening.
Yeah, this year, for the first time that I can remember, certainly it came the day after the Tour of Lombardy, and as an armchair spectator, as I was this weekend, it worked very well because the two races, they were similar but very different. Decent field at Paris Tour, although I think that the fact that it's not a World Tour race, it did mean that Quick Step Floors didn't have a great deal of opposition. I mean, there were good riders in other teams, but it wasn't a World Tour level field, and I think it probably would have been a better race had it had everybody there. And I think there was certainly worked having two big races to watch on consecutive days at the weekend. I mean, just earlier when I was advocating moving Il Lombardia to the spring, I took a position, not necessarily one that, I gave it my best shot, and before I'd even stopped speaking, I'd changed my mind. But I had a go. But I do think that this tail end of the season, there has been a sense of rejuvenation in a way. In as you say, those. The Italian races leading up to Lombardy, they were all good. If Paris Tour had something similar, or if there was a similar sort of swing of racing, I just think that you're absolutely right, Daniel. Once the Vuelta's finished, there's the World Championships, and then it does kind of, the engine stalling a bit and everything's puttering out to a fairly flat conclusion. I mean, I don't know what to expect from the Presidential Tour of Turkey and then the new World Tour race in China, the Tour of Guangxi, I think, if my Chinese pronunciation is passable. I mean, they really will have a kind of an end of season feel, I suspect, but who knows? Once the season is a long time over, isn't it? Well, it's not really. It's a couple of months over.
All.
It kicks off again very soon. But by the end of November,
Lionel, we all yearn wistfully for the days of the Tour of Beijing. The long lamented Tour of Beijing.
But can you name any of the Tour of Beijing winners?
Tony Martin.
That was the only one I could think of. But
I just remember the smog. I mean, again, you struck watching the Italian races by how important the crowds are. Basically, bike races without crowds really do lack something.
But again, obvious. Rich, there's been a rejuvenation there certainly in the last couple of years, and we've mentioned it in the past couple of seasons as well about the growing stature of Nibali and how he has really become much more of a well-known public figure in Italy. And I think a lot of it's on the back of that. The Italians love to sort of focus their support and focus their affection on one heroic figure. And they've got that at the moment in Nibali. And from the race's point of view, there could have been no better winner than him. I mean, I'm sure RCS were rubbing their hands.
Paris Tour, though, chaps. We were going to talk about the race there. What happened? Matteo Trentin won it, of course, for the second time. I mean, it was interesting to watch the finale because there was a real conundrum for Quick-Step, wasn't there, when Fernando Gaviria crashed and really was left to his own. Did really well to get back into the group, really chasing on his own. When you see him going past groups of dropped riders, it's quite remarkable. Nobody dropped back to help him until quite late on, when Zdeněk Štibar appeared. But it was obvious. It was obviously because they had another card to play, and that was Trentin, who attacked on the climb and took away Nicky Terpstra and Søren Kragh Andersen. Sunweb also, I thought, rode a very impressive race, and they clearly had a plan too. So it was fitting that those two teams were represented in that move at the end.
Yeah, Quick-Step had two, strong alternatives, but perhaps they didn't want to risk it coming down to a conventional sprint, because it wasn't a bad field of sprinters at all. Buhani was in there, Mark Cavendish was in there, Andre Greipel, who finished third, was in there, Dylan Groenewegen was in there.
Greipel.
Fourth, yeah, just off the podium, of course, but he won the group sprint, didn't he? So it was a good race. It was one of those, as you said, you mentioned the sort of Milan-San Remo thing to it, in that it's finely balanced. Those two climbs and the positioning of them mean that there's a suspense in the final 20 kilometres of whether anyone will get away or whether it will come down to the old style Paris Tour sprint that we used to see. Disappointed that Brian Alaphilippe, who was riding for the French Army team, didn't try something. He's not quite as good as his brother, is he?
Maybe he did, but we didn't see him, Lionel, because they were in camouflage.
In their camouflage kit, indeed.
Is that why we've never seen Julien emerge from that tunnel in Bergen?
Possibly. Speaking of brothers, Lawrence Narsson was in the
he looked good.
In the two-man break, wasn't he? Oliver Narsson's brother, of course. Oliver Narsson's the current Belgian champion, and Lawrence is joining Lotto Soudal.
A rangy rider, but he looked very good, didn't he? He looked very strong in that break. Mark Cavendish. I'm actually doing an event with Mark Cavendish on Friday in London, the Esquire Townhouse. He got any tips, Daniel?
No. I would suggest that you make the point that he hasn't had the best of seasons.
I'm not going to mention
less
that.
forcefully than I'm about to do. No, I wouldn't. No, it's been obviously a difficult season for Cavendish. He struggled with illness early in the year, and then he had his crash at the Tour de France, where he ended up crashing into barriers, didn't he, on stage 3 or 4 or 5. And he's not really been able to get back on track, has he, this autumn? I mean, I sort of hope for him that Paris Tour could redeem his season slightly. It was the last chance. He's coming into slightly better form, but his training didn't go particularly well when he started again after it was a shoulder blade injury that he sustained at the Tour de France, and he hasn't quite got back up to speed again. And next year's an important year for him. Last year of his contract with Dimension Data, and in one sense he's got a perfect opportunity now to sort of carry on his training, get ahead for next year. But he really does need to hit the ground.
I'm just making a list of things not to ask him about. He's actually riding the London 60 in a couple of weeks as well with Peter Kenyon, which is a mouth-watering prospect.
He'll win that. I'm pretty confident he'll win that. Just before we move on to the final part, the Tour of Beijing, 4 editions from 2011 to 2014. Tony Martin won the first 2. Bernat Inchausti won in 2013, and Philippe Gilbert won in 2014. So quite an impressive list of winners there. Great race, long lamented Tour of Beijing, but maybe the Tour of Guangxi will be equally gripping.
Hi, my name's Simon. I work at Rafa and I'm head of R&D. Involves creating new technologies, so I'm involved in future projects, concepts, like a precursor to design. So I get the fun stuff. I can't talk about it at all. I'd love to tell you about it, but I have to kill you probably. Recently, I did the TT suit for Team Sky last year, which was a really fun aero project. Shadow was one of my projects as well, which I did 2 seasons ago, which has been a really interesting project. That's a bit of a game changer in terms of technology for shorts, so that was cool.
The Rafa Cycling Club is the largest global community of its kind. Members share their passion for the road through rides, events, exclusive club kit and racing. Find out more at rafa.cc.
Thank you very much as ever to Rafa, our main sponsor for sponsoring the Cycling Podcast. A reminder that you can get your Rafa Cycling Podcast clothing, Pedlar de Charme clothing, at rafa.cc, or if you go to the shop page at thecyclingpodcast.com. They did sell out of jerseys, which is very encouraging, but they will be back on sale very, very soon, and there'll be a new female range as well, Pedaleuse de Charme. So go there, and if you buy that kit, you help to support the Cycling Podcast as well. So we're very, very pleased to see you all out in your Pedlar de Charme cycling jerseys and t-shirts and caps. I mentioned this last week. Can't really put too much more meat on the bones yet of this, but keep Monday the 20th of November free in the evening. If you're in central London, or if you can come to central London, we'll be doing an event. Details to follow in terms of location and so on, but it should be good. It should be the biggest event we've done yet, and we'll have some familiar friends and guests there, so do keep a note of that date, and we'll announce details of that very, very soon. Anything else coming up, chaps? We've got a couple more Friends specials to come. Daniel's off to Sunweb this week. I'm off to Nice with Orla Shinoui to do some recording for the Cycling Podcast Femina, and also for a couple of Friends specials that are coming up. Lionel's got a lunch date with somebody soon for another Friends special this year. We've got 2 to come this year, and I think the first one will be the Sunweb story. They've had a remarkable season, and Daniel's going to go and speak to them about that this week. You all set for that, Daniel?
Yeah, well, I'm pumped. I'm psyched.
Pumped?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Richard, you said that
Excellent.
Daniel was off to Sunweb like it's an independent country or something.
Well, they are a holiday company, aren't they?
Yes,
so, he's off on a Sunweb holiday. If you can find out a little bit more about the company Sunweb, Daniel, I'm kind of curious, because
To be honest, Rich, I don't think that's really a good use of my 20 minutes with Tom Dumoulin. To be honest.
Yeah.
I bow to your better journalistic judgment.
No.
We've fought hard for these 20 minutes.
just look them up on Wikipedia or something. Ignore that, or refer to our ethical report from earlier this season. No, but I don't know an awful lot about Sunweb, the company. Maybe we can find out a bit more about that for this special. But yeah, don't ask Tom Dumoulin about Sunweb. Anyway. In this final part, I mean, we should maybe introduce a regular feature. What's Gianni Moscon done this week? Any updates?
Well, I don't think he did a whole lot, actually. Well, he didn't do a whole lot on the weekend at the Tour of Lombardy. There was Alexis Villelmoz was gesticulating wildly at the finish, suggesting that Gianni Moscon had done something heinous in the sprint for... Was it the sprint for third place? It was. But with the the footage wasn't really able to shed too much light on what Moscon had supposedly done. It looked as though he just pretty much held his line in the sprint, but again, not making too many friends on the other side of the Alps in France. And actually, the one thing he did do was that in his interview, post-race interview, he was asked by Rai Television, so Italian television, about Villelmoz and also about the incident earlier in the week with Sebastian Reichenbach. Reichenbach, of course, went to hospital, and now La Française des Jeux have made a complaint to the police, who are looking into it. And Moscon was asked about that, and he said, well, I don't know what their problem is, but whenever there is any kind of issue, FDJ are always the first to complain. And he referred back to the Tour de France, where Sky used a contentious skin suit in the first stage in Dusseldorf, and Française des Jeux were reported to have made some kind of complaint. I don't actually think they did. They aired some misgivings in the press. But yeah, Moscon feels that FDJ in particular have got it in for him.
Yeah, although this does date back to his incident at Tour de Romandie where he racially abused Kevin Reza. I don't think FDJ made him do that, did they? I mean, we talked about this last week, the incident, or the alleged incident with Reichenbach. You weren't with us then, Lionel. We covered it fairly comprehensively, I think. We don't know a great deal. I mean, I understand that he said that he was spoken to by the race jury after the race, who obviously were aware of the complaint then, and no action was taken by them. There seems to be a police involvement. As far as I know, the UCI have not been in touch with his team or anything. The team don't seem to be investigating it. They seem happy and confident that what Moscon says is the truth, that he didn't knock Reichenbach off. But I do fear a little bit that that the authorities, the cycling authorities, including his team and the UCI, may hide behind this police investigation and not do anything. I mean, when there's violent conduct, it's usually punished. Grifko earlier this year was punished for punching Marcel Kittel, wasn't he? He received a ban. It should certainly be investigated, shouldn't it? And if, as Reichenbach says, there are witnesses to it, then if it's proven that he did something to Reichenbach, then Moscon should be punished for it. He should be banned.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rich. I think the problem is that crashes happen all the time in cycling, and the apportioning of blame is not necessarily something that that the riders get into too much. There's often somebody to blame, in the sense that they've not seen an obstacle in the road, or they've ridden into somebody's back wheel, or they've braked too suddenly, or they've misjudged a corner. And I think that there's a really delicate line to be trodden here, because there's a big difference between innocently causing a crash and it's an accident, and unfortunately people have come off, some better, some worse, and the race carries on. There's a big difference between run-of-the-mill crashes and a team and a rider alleging that somebody caused a crash deliberately, which is what Reichenbach is saying, and that really crosses a line, and that is something that should be looked at and investigated, however difficult that may be, because it would rely on witness testimony from other riders, riders who saw the incident and would be asked to give their interpretation. And whenever, it's the same thing that you have in other sports, and sorry to sort of drag football into it, but often when there are foul challenges in football, the debate is whether it was intentional, and should it have been a yellow card, should it have been a red card, and the debate goes on and on and on. of course, serious injury can happen in football, but when you're racing bicycles, the potential injuries are so much more severe if something goes wrong, that it's a serious issue. It's not one to be sort of treated lightly. And so looking at it from a real distance as I am, and having now listened to your talk about it last week, the danger here is that this opens a can of worms that may be very difficult to shut. But that is not to say that if a rider feels that they have been knocked off deliberately, that they should keep quiet about it. So it's a really sensitive, tricky one for everyone to deal with. And the fact that nobody in authority seems to be dealing with it doesn't reflect terribly well on the sport.
The history here, and I don't know if we really covered this last week, was Reichenbach was the rider who publicly shamed, I suppose, Gianni Moscon at the Tour de Romandie for racially abusing Kevin Reza. I mean, Reza confronted Moscon at the finish, and that was captured on camera. But it was Reichenbach that tweeted about it, and that certainly annoyed Moscon, and there's been bad blood between them ever since. So. There is a bit of history there.
We think there has been bad blood with them, although publicly Moscon has suggested that there's been no further contact. I think they both said that there's been no further contact at all, no further interaction.
Yeah. Okay, well, I understand some resentment then, perhaps, harboured by Moscon. And
I'm sure Reichenbach and Francis Dijer's sort of aggrievement, is that a word?
Okay, bad blood was the wrong expression. I think resentment. I think that Moscon is not happy that Reichenbach's role in that scandal and that controversy. So that's the history, and whatever happened in the race will hopefully be established.
I will just make the point though that this is an issue with we're talking about Moscon and Sky, but it is an indication that when there are perhaps smaller misdemeanors or misdemeanors that could be dealt with and they're not, they're kind of just left to just sort of go, I guess. Is anyone sort of Moscon's reputation is not being enhanced by these several incidents all taking place in the same year, and yet he is one of the best young riders in the world, and that means that the team management particularly have to, I think, take a firmer hand more publicly in sort of nurturing and showing the rider the right way, and making sure that for a good period of time he stays out of the spotlight and stays away from any kind of controversial incidents. I think that's something that the team ought to take responsibility for.
I agree. I completely agree.
Yeah, a couple more points, chaps. I mean, I'm sure FDJ and Reichenbach are doubly aggrieved because they knew immediately that the injuries were pretty serious. In fact, he had 2 operations last week at home in Martigny, in French-speaking part of Switzerland. One on his elbow, one on his hip, and he's not going to be able to train for 3 or 4 months. So it was a pretty nasty injury. And just on Moscon, I mean, it was interesting watching him being, well, not really quizzed or cross-examined at all, but getting a fairly sort of easy time, some soft questions about FDJ and Reichenbach and the incidents on Italian TV. And he will be indulged in Italy, and is already being indulged in Italy. I'm just watching the Italian coverage of the World Championships as well, and he's very much already becoming the golden boy of Italian cycling. And we've talked before about the way the Italians have treated dopers and the sort of indulgence that they've been shown, having Danilo De Luca on Italian TV when he was banned as a studio guest at the Giro d'Italia, and so forth and so forth. And Moscon will get plenty of that. So that's not to excuse the way he has behaved in the past and the way he might still behave in the future.
Well,
but the pressure that puts even more pressure, I think, on his other entourage, which is his team, and also friends and people he knows in cycling, to remind him that what is and what isn't acceptable.
We were chatting yesterday, weren't we, about the other sort of bad boy of cycling, Nasser Bouhanni, and how that image became part of his marketability almost, and remains so, while also being a bit of a problem for him and his team in terms of getting results. You know, most obviously when he punched somebody last year and injured his hand and missed the Tour de France.
And Birnie is an example, Rich, of someone who unfortunately is not really learning, or is not curbing his temper, which is the main problem with Birnie, and it continues to get him in trouble. Last week at Paris Tour, there was an altercation with Rudy Barbier of AG2R after the finish. Captured on camera some pretty fruity language from Birnie, and you know the Cofidis have tried, but Birnie's also been indulged. He's been indulged with a huge salary. He's been indulged with the kind of entourage that they've assembled around him. They've even given his dad a job, and one of his dad's main responsibilities is to try and calm him down after races, which doesn't seem to be working. And you know, it's a bit of a fork in the road, isn't it, for a lot of riders, a lot of sort of hot-headed riders at an early stage in their career, and they go one of two ways. They either continue to behave in an immature fashion and not learn their lessons, or they eventually, you know, they smooth out the rough edges. And you know, I'm not sure, we talked last week about Mark Cavendish, but he certainly had a period in his career in 2010 when you know, he celebrated a victory at the Tour of Romandy by sticking two fingers up, and then a few weeks later he had a bad crash with Heinrich Hausler, and most people felt that he had, well, whether he was to blame or not, but he'd ridden a fairly dangerous sprint, and Heinrich Hausler certainly thought that he'd caused the crash. But I'm not saying that Cavendish doesn't still have rough edges, but he eventually did mature to a large extent, and Moscon has to do that.
Well, in professional sport, though, talent is largely indulged, isn't it? That's the problem. Whether it's you know, in the arena or away from the arena, difficult personalities will be coped with, worked around, and made allowances for, if they are delivering the goods. And I think that's the biggest problem for Moscon, is that his talent is likely to mean that his behaviour is indulged, and you know, it ends up in further controversial incidents in the coming years, until he realises that it's damaging him.
And in fact, Lionel, I would suggest that in Cavendish's case, he did start to mature and mellow slightly when he realised that he couldn't be quite so dominant anymore, and he couldn't, you know, the 2011, his team came to the end of the road, HTC, and you know, that was one big blow, and then over the next couple of years there were a few more setbacks that made him realise, I think, that he couldn't have it all his own way, and that he had to also confront his responsibilities at times, and I think he did that eventually, and Moscon's going to have to do that.
Anything else this week, chaps?
No, not really, Rich.
Come on, guys.
I'm looking forward to the presidential tour of Turkey, which starts a little bit later on.
Are you on their payroll? Are you an ambassador or something? Are you on the payroll? Because you mentioned that race several times.
No, I'm not. I've never accepted they always offer a free journalist trip. I've never accepted that for various reasons. But the race.
What a principled man you are, Lionel.
I'm not saying. I didn't mean it to sound like I'm. You know, I have some kind of principle that's. Well, I'm digging deeper here. Hang on.
if you don't like my principles, I can get some new ones.
No, but
yeah.
As the season ends, guys, you know, I'll watch anything now, literally anything over the winter. You know, the cyclocross will be on.
Well, in the absence of a lot of racing, we will, over the next few weeks, we'll have, next week, of course, is the Tour de France route announcement, so next week's podcast will cover that. Other weeks we'll have little treats, won't we? Little surprise things that we've got lined up. We'll not spoil the surprise now, but something a bit different most weeks, I think.
We will, and before we know it, will be Christmas, and then it will all start again.
Tour Down Under, here we come. Anyway, let's wrap things up for this week. Do remember to put the 20th of November in your diaries, and we'll speak to you again next week discussing the 2018 Tour de France route. Lionel, thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Lionel.